Is prison labor a form of slavery? Hi, my name is Dr. Astar Bear, and that's the question that we're going to be considering in this presentation. So when you see images of inmates working like like this, right? Look at this. I mean, this presents a lot of similarities, a lot of parallels with what we've seen in the past, right? So, I mean, prison labor seems like slavery. It looks like it, and a lot of people say it is. Um, it seems to have a lot of the same features that we associate with slavery, but on the other hand, you could make a case against it as well, right? And some people do. They say, look, it's not, okay? It's the inmates are paid, yes, usually far less than workers outside prison. Uh, there's usually a waiting list to participate in prison labor. It doesn't seem like slavery. Inmates are not owned property. They can't be bought or sold. They're not used as collateral. All the things that we know from the, written into a will. All the things that we can use property for, that slaves were used for in the antebellum period. None of that stuff is true for inmates. Okay, so is prison labor slavery? I mean, that's the question, right? So to answer that, we have to really look at, well, what is slavery? What is our, how do we define that? And so the issue here is slavery is very old. I mean, it's been part of many human societies, right? So there's lots of different historical forms, and then we have to ask the question, what do they have in common? And that gets us into like our theory of slavery. How do we understand it? Okay. Um, Now, the way that we understand slavery depends on what aspects of it we choose to focus on to form these common elements. Uh, how is slavery different from other forms of production, like I mentioned a few, right? Feudalism or sharecropping or peasant farming or debt peonage or capitalism. I mean, there's all of these terms represent ways of thinking about different social systems and kinds of production and so on. Um, and how do we organize all the different things that often go along with it? I mean, conquest and violence, for example, uh, political forces, laws, economic processes, the labor process. Um, the culture, things like racism, right? Though all of this comes into play when we create our definition or our theoretical understanding of, well, what is slavery? Okay, and of course, it's going to depend on our point of view. Um, in this presentation, we're going to use Marxian class analysis in order to theorize slavery. Okay, so class is defined in Marxism as the relationship to the production and appropriation of surplus labor at a given site in society. Labor can be divided into necessary labor, okay, that which is needed to meet the socialized needs of the direct producer, and then surplus labor, that's labor that is above and beyond that. Now, if we're going to be using class, we want to avoid economic or class determinism, other kinds of determinism. We don't want to create a simplistic understanding of society here, right? Because we know that society is very complex, okay? So we do not want to construct class as the essential feature of society, okay? The thing that determines all other things. That wouldn't be a good idea, wouldn't be very accurate. Um, Class is rather, we want to see that as an entry point for understanding society among many other possible entry points. Of course, we have no way of knowing which entry point is better, okay? We don't possess the absolute truth about the economy or society. Slavery has a class structure, okay? That's who performs the necessary and surplus labor, who appropriates the products of the labor, especially the surplus, okay? And slavery also has a non-class structure. So what that means is, what are all the social, political, economic, and natural processes that provide the conditions of existence for the class structure? Okay, so if we look at this class structure, what do we call that? Well, we're going to call it the slave fundamental class process. which I'll abbreviate SFCP since it's kind of a long phrase. So slaves perform necessary labor and surplus labor, okay? And then the master appropriates the entire product and gives to the slaves what we call a master's provision, okay, to meet the slave's socially and biologically determined needs. So very important, the reproduction of the slave's labor power occurs within the relationship of master and slave. And if we look at the non-class structure, right, all other processes which form the conditions of existence for the slave fundamental class process, like I said, we could divide these into political, cultural, economic, natural, if we like, right? Just noting that there's many of these, right? And then look at how does this react with or create one particular kind of process in society that's of particular interest, right? And that is the ownership of the slave's labor power by the master. That's an important one that we want to return to that, okay? And then how does this then relate to the slave fundamental class process, the question of who produces and who appropriates the surplus, okay? And we want to construct these as having complex relationships with one another, okay? So the double arrow shows, okay, this is not a single-sided relationship. It's a relationship of complexity where they both cause and affect each other, right? That's so what we sometimes call a mutually constitutive relationship, right? We're not talking about A causes B. We're talking about these different processes existing in a very complex, dynamic, dialectical relationship with one another. The labor power of the enslaved person becomes the property of the slaveholder. It is a commodity over which the slaveholder has complete control. A free laborer can enter or withdraw from the labor market at any time, but a slave cannot. He or she cannot sell his or her own labor power and thereby commodify it. This is true whether the period of enslavement is fixed, temporary, or indefinite. So this is from Kevin Bales from his 2005 work, Understanding Global Slavery. So an influential theorist of modern slavery, though he does not really use a class analysis, he's obviously very influenced by Marxism and especially the concept of labor power, using the same idea that I'm talking about, the ownership of labor power, defining that as very, very important. Now we also see other theorists who have very different ideological commitments. So for example, the neoclassical economic historians, Vogel and Ingerman, they are on the opposite side of Marxism, right? So Vogel and Ingerman use the term human capital rather than labor power, but they clearly mean the same thing by it. They mean the capacity of a worker to labor for a given period of time, okay? And here's their statement on this, okay? The crucial difference between slave and free society rests not on the existence of property rights in man, in human capital, but on who may hold title to such property rights. Under freedom, each person holds title more or less to his own human capital. He is prevented by law from selling the title to this capital except for quite limited periods of time, and then only under a very restricted set of conditions. In slave societies, however, a large number of individuals were permanently deprived of the title to their own human capital. So you can already kind of see using the phrase human capital is a very different focus. And I think, Vogel and Ingerman, there's certain conceptual problems that they have here. They do not distinguish very well between the ownership of a person and the ownership of the labor power, right? So, there's a number of things that they miss, but they are focusing on much the same idea, right? That is, who owns your labor power, your ability to perform labor? Is it you or is it somebody else, right? So a lot of theorists of slavery, the point is that a lot of theorists of slavery have used the same kind of focus, have singled out a part of the non-class structure that's in Marxian language now. Vogel and Ingerman do not use the concept of class at all, so they don't consider something class or non-class, but that's the kind of language that we're using here because, again, class is in the forefront of the analysis. Okay, so if we look at the ownership of human labor power, we agree that that's important, okay? We say, look, ownership, again, is a non-class process. It doesn't really tell us anything about labor. So if those who are owned do not perform labor, they do not directly produce value, then they're not in the slave fundamental class process, okay? So we have to recognize that the slave fundamental class process might only be a subset, okay? There may be some whose labor power that is owned who aren't in that, right? They don't perform labor. You have to be performing necessary and surplus labor to be in the slave fundamental class process, okay? So again, it's a subset. You got to be performing necessary and surplus labor. It's appropriated by your master. You get a master's provision, etc., like I mentioned before. So let's consider then the political conditions of existence, which give rise to the slave fundamental class process in prisons. And by that we mean processes that concern power, authority, and the creation and enforcement of rules and laws in society, with particular focus on, the prison itself, because that's our area of concern. Okay, so the first thing that we confronted with is a legal and constitutional basis to compel labor and appropriate surplus. And of course, that comes from the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery, which left a kind of a loophole there. Okay, it says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the parties shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So, okay, wow, leaving a pretty big loophole there for prisons. Now, participating in the slave fundamental class process can significantly reduce an inmate's sentence. Okay, so, the basic deal here is to say, hey, we're putting you in a cage by force, right? That's what incarceration is. We're keeping you in this cage, but if you do this, we will keep you in the cage a shorter period of time, right? That's a pretty strong motivator, right? And obviously it's pretty coercive as well, right? Because that wouldn't be a plus unless, the correctional authorities had total control over the inmates, which of course they do, okay? So participating in prison labor is considered good behavior, which can lead to early release or parole. Some states, jurisdictions make this much more explicit. So in California, for example, an inmate's sentence is reduced by 1 day for each day in the slave fundamental class process. They don't call it that, right? They call it just employment. But, I'm trying to be consistent with our terminology. So you could potentially cut your sentence in half by participating here. That's quite an inducement. Now, of course, the warden and the correctional authorities can compel the inmates to perform labor by force. That's very, very clear, right? The entire system of prison, of course, rests on force. You can see that these guys here are very much prepared to, apply force, right? So, like I say, right, the warden and correctional authorities have enormous power over the inmates. They can punish or reward inmates in many, many different ways. A lot of what correctional management is figuring out, well, how do you apply this power, given that there's also limits on what can be done legally. So how do you work within that system to apply power, right? Well, first of all, there's levels of security for inmates, okay? So inmates get more privileges, they get more freedoms based on their level, or fewer freedoms that can be taken away as well. So that's one point of leverage. Certain things can be removed, such as visitation or commissary rights or things like this, right? Or I should say privileges, right? Everything is framed in terms of privileges to give you the idea that anything could be taken away. You'll be placed in solitary confinement or administrative segregation. So this is kind of the same thing that I've been talking about, right? Like this would be, a high security level to be placed in solitary confinement, but very often done for punitive purposes. All right, so your cell could be searched for contraband, or your person could be searched for contraband. Now, there's a lot of disallowed items in prison, so there's a lot. Contraband is like a really big category, right? And the prison officials usually look the other way So there's a lot of contraband in prison because, when you've outlawed nearly everything, I mean, then there's going to be contraband, right? Um, so if you decide to like really enforce the rules on an inmate, that's a way of punishing them. It's a sneaky, because it's like, okay, we're just following the rules, which we don't normally follow 95% of the time, right? But so we're going to bust you for contraband whenever we can, right? That's often a punishment, right? Just enforcing the rules which are already there but are not normally enforced. Um, Now, probably the most like clearly violent kind of, forcing the inmate to do something is seen in cell extraction. All right, this is the process where the inmate's forcibly removed from the cell. It's a bit like an arrest outside, but it's like, okay, an arrest doesn't have to be violent, but it often is. In practice, it is quite often, that the ones doing the arrest or the extraction, whatever the case may be, uh, they take the opportunity to add some gratuitous violence to the situation, right? The head of the Department of Corrections owns the labor power of the inmates, and we can see this. The person of the inmate is not owned, but their capacity to perform labor is owned as long as the inmate is incarcerated. And the Department of Corrections can and does rent the inmate's labor power to other parties, and they can prevent the inmate from selling their labor power to anyone who's not authorized. So that's what ownership is, right? It's total control over someone else's labor power. So whether you use that control or not, it turns out the Department of Corrections does not use that ownership in all cases. So because of the complex history, which we'll get into briefly later on. Um, However, they very clearly own that, right? The political conditions of existence create this ownership. All right, now let's look at the cultural conditions of existence that also play a role here. Okay, what are cultural conditions of existence? These are those processes that create certain meanings in a social site. They are created often by the entire society. They influence how the individual thinks about their role in society, more generally, how they give meaning to their life. It's the process of giving meaning to a certain role or a certain kind of production, etc. All right. So part of this has to do with the creation of the criminal as a category. Okay, what is this? What does this category mean, right? Now we can look at ancient Rome. Okay, in ancient Rome, Roman law, the slave is the one who lacks honor. Okay, so Roman law excluded testimony from slaves. Importantly, a little exception to that, unless they were tortured. That was the only way that they saw as being trustworthy, because slaves lacked honor. The Roman society created a unique kind of objectification of slaves, but that process of objectifying another human being, considering them to be an object less than human. Roman law, they called a slave, was considered a res. They had a special legal category for a semi-person, a person object, right? And this takes place in prisons in a different way, right? Through the creation of this objectified category, okay, the criminal. Clearly inferior. I mean, all you have to say, like, hey, I look at the way inmates are being treated in prison, and what's somebody going to say who wants to defend it? They're going to say they're criminals, right? Um, to punish or reform the criminal, nearly anything is permissible. Why? Well, because we put them in a different category, right? And that has a very deep meaning. That's something that marks you for your whole life, right? Um, you could have served your time and get out of prison, but what are people going to say about you when push comes to shove? They're going to say, you can't trust this person, they're a criminal, right? Even if you have told the truth in every single interaction, people are going to say, well, that's a criminal, right? That marking goes very, very deep because it's something that our culture has created, right? So this is not an individualized process, right? Now you might embrace that, right? Some inmates, like this fellow here, right? mark themselves with this, right? So this guy's not trying to hide, right? I mean, he's got a very big tattoo, right? A very big marking that sort of celebrates that. See, it says mob on the back there, right? It just celebrates that criminal status as a way of trying to, you know, probably a way of trying to take control of it, right? To empower. Um, all right. So we also see this in a creation of a slave identity. Okay. So one of the great theorists of slavery, Patterson, describes this in a quote. He says that changing of name is almost universally a symbolic act of stripping a person of his former identity. Note, for example, the tendency among modern peoples to assign a new formal identification, usually a number, to both prisoners of war and domestic convicts. Okay, so taking away your old identity, taking away your old name, giving you a number, right? So you are now a criminal. Okay, you're in a different category, and to you, the morals and rules of society no longer apply, right? We have a very strong moral in society that is anti-slavery, right? The entire global society is anti-slavery. We used to argue about whether slavery was good or bad or whatever, right? During the, debates over slavery in the United States. We no longer argue about that. There's no longer anybody on the pro-slavery side, right? We have universal agreement that enslavement is wrong, morally wrong. It's not acceptable, except for the criminal, right? Um, that is right. We have to note how extraordinary that is. Next, we're going to discuss the economic conditions of existence here. So that is processes that concern the production, consumption, and distribution of wealth. So inmates often desire money income and are cut off from many ways of obtaining one. Uh, Though not every instance of the slave fundamental class process in prisons provides a money income, many do. Inmates' ability to spend money is very limited. Okay, the prisons try to stomp out, the use of paper money. Everything's electronic. Uh, you have spending limits as part of this and whatever. But the point is, an income allows you to live better in prison, just like it does outside prison. Um, there's some inmates, seek an income to support a family outside, for instance. There's lots of reasons why you'd want a money income in prison. Um, and then there's different levels of money payments to different labor tasks, different types of, as they're called, employment. And these function to control inmates, right? Because again, if there's a desire for a money income, then saying, okay, you can do this one, but you better do a good job, otherwise you're going to be cast out of it, right? That becomes a real inducement, and that's another lever of control for inmates. Okay, so we have to also take note that prisons provide a universal welfare for the inmates. All right, what this means is that inmates receive a bundle of goods and services, and that comprise their consumption, regardless of whether or not they labor. And it consists of commodities and use values. Again, much of it's due to legal requirements and so forth. But let's just examine this. Okay, so what commodities do inmates receive? They receive clothing, they receive shelter, right? They receive heat, water, electricity, other utilities. They also get services, so medical and dental care. Now, this care is often not the best, but again, this is the provision of commodities, okay, that is part of the law, okay? They get personal hygiene products, they get correspondence products. All of these are commodities. They also get goods and services that are produced within the prison. And so what I call this is prison household use values. A little bit of an awkward phrase, but the goods and services that are produced for use within the household, this is often called household production in economics, and prisons do a version of this, right? They do household production as well. So they produce use values, but they are not commodities. They don't have they're not bought and sold in the market, okay? So, and this consists of prepared meals, of the laundering of clothing, of clean spaces, groundskeeping and the maintenance of the prison facilities and equipment. These are prison household use values. I'll have more to say about that later on because it turns out that the inmates' labor produces a lot of this stuff. Now, the correctional authorities control the provision of this welfare, and they may, within limits, they can withdraw portions of it or substitute inferior elements. Okay, so you have to feed the inmates, right? But what if you could feed them much worse food if you wanted to, right? If an inmate got out of line, you could feed them, let's say, something like this, right? The prison food loaf. And it's made by, well, taking the foods that the inmates were going to receive and blending them all together. Sometimes they're blended in a, with a high-speed blender. Not this one hasn't been, but and then cooking them in a loaf, which it's like you're intentionally trying to create something that's horrible, right? I mean, doesn't this look horrible? This is again, you're still providing welfare, but you're providing a worse version of it, right? You're still providing food. You're bound to provide the inmates with food, but could you provide them with worse food? Okay, so the answer is yeah, of course you could, right? Now you have to provide the inmates with shelter. Okay, so you can see, here we have the inmates, bunks, right, and their bedding. But what if you took this away? What if you put them on sheet restriction and you said, okay, well, we're going to take away these blankets and sheets right here? Well, your life would be made worse, wouldn't it? You'd still have shelter, but worse shelter. What if we took away your mattress as well? Okay, look at this. This is like a metal frame that has springs across it. Imagine sleeping on that with nothing, right? It's going to be a lot less comfortable, right? So again, the correctional authorities can, they have to provide the welfare, but they could provide a worse version of it. All right. So, however, the fact that this welfare exists allows the master's provision to fall. Okay, because what it essentially does is it says, okay, the appropriator of the surplus no longer has to concern themselves as much with the reproduction of the inmate's labor power, right? The slave's labor power. That labor power is going to get reproduced anyway. Okay, so this is a phrase that's used in Marxism to say reproduction of labor power. What it means is the maintenance or the continuance of a person's ability to perform labor in a given period of time, right? People have needs, right? They a combination of biological and socially constructed needs. If they don't receive that, then they're not going to be able to continue to provide labor. So by covering that, right, the prison labor or the prison welfare allows the master's provision to fall potentially to zero. So I hope this makes it clear, right? The set of political, cultural, and economic processes that I mentioned forms the conditions of existence for slavery to exist in U.S. prisons. We have now defined what is slavery and explored, well, what is the unique form that it takes in U.S. prisons. So there's two types of productions that occur, okay? And I've alluded to this already, right? One of them is commodity production. So that means producing goods and services for sale. That's the definition of a commodity. And in this, we would include things like license plates and mattresses and other kinds of furniture and clothing and lenses for eyewear and agricultural products and services like telemarketing and customer support. And here's a visible one you often see inmates picking up litter by the side of the road, right? So all of these are commodities, right? These are goods and services produced for sale. But this isn't all of the production that occurs because there's also these household production, right? The use values. They're not commodities because they're not being produced for sale, but they still have value, right? So again, we mentioned some of these, right? The cooking has value, right? It can be a commodity or not, right? It's a commodity when you go to a restaurant, you get a cooked meal. It's not a commodity if somebody cooks you a meal and invites you over or whatever. They're not charging, that's not a market, right? You cook a meal for yourself, it's the same process. Maybe the result isn't as good or whatever, but it's the same process, right? So cooking for use within the prison, or cleaning, again, for use within the prison, or maintenance, or groundskeeping, or laundry. These are the list of, and there may be other ones as well, but these are kind of the main ones, right? The production of use values for use within the prison, mostly for use by inmates, but it could also be by others. It's also by employees and so forth. The prison guards and administration and so on. All right. So we have to look at these two types of production. Okay. So if we're focused on the class structure, well, we want to know who does the appropriation, right? That's very, very important. Who appropriates in prisons? And the answer is, well, it depends. It depends on what type of thing we're looking at, right? So both prison commodity production and prison household production are affected by the non-class structure that defines slavery, and but they have different structures of appropriation. So we have to look at that, right? So in commodity production, we've got a couple of different possible structures of appropriation, okay? Because it depends what's going on, right? So we could have what I call state appropriation, okay? Here, the appropriator is the head of a state agency, and this state agency is usually a part of the Department of Corrections. Though sometimes it's a private or quasi-private enterprise or whatever. It's given responsibility for industrial production in all the state prisons. So there's, like I said, usually a separate agency for that, a sub-agency. Though the appropriation is done by the head of this state agency, it's really the head of the Department of Corrections that is the ultimate owner of the inmate labor power. What's happening, right, the head of the Department of Corrections is essentially giving or renting the inmate labor power that they own to another party, okay, which then makes use of it, okay. So they're essentially getting something for either for free or for very low cost. Now, there's also private appropriation in state prisons, and this has gotten a lot more attention, okay? So, because this is where a private enterprise is given permission to produce in a prison and then hence to appropriate the inmate slave surplus labor, they are given that permission usually in exchange for something, right? They have to pay the prison for this. So again, this is very much the parallel of the slave rental markets that existed in the antebellum South and in the Caribbean and Brazil and places like this, right? The modern slavery often had a very well-developed rental market where you could rent a slave, usually for the day, which that you did not own, right? You didn't have to buy the slave, just like you might not have to buy an expensive machine. You could just simply rent that, okay? And the third possibility here is the private appropriation that's in a privatized prison, okay? So this is where the entire a private enterprise is given permission by the head of the Department of Corrections to incarcerate the inmates, right? And, they're paid for that. And then they can also appropriate the inmate surplus labor, okay? So 3 different forms. There's more subforms within this. There's different, combinations of private and state partnerships and whatever. But these are kind of the main ones for commodity production. All right, then if we look at the household production in prisons, again, we've got the state prisons, okay? The appropriator there is the warden of the prison, right? The state provides a warden with a budget to cover certain expenses, the cost of the means of production, the raw materials, any payments that go, right? So again, if you're going to be doing cooking, you need some raw materials, right? You need the food. Cleaning, you need cleaning supplies and so on, right? So the warden buys all these things with their budget that they get from the state, but they're also driven to provide these use values, to the inmates, to the prison itself, and so they're the ones who are designated to head up that kind of production. Okay, so in the case of private prisons, the appropriator of the surplus is again the private enterprise that's charged with running that prison, and the state provides a payment to the enterprise per inmate incarcerated, and then it becomes that enterprise's responsibility to produce all of these household use values. All right, when we look at the proportions here, okay, here's what we find, right? We find that a lot of the inmates, the vast majority, in fact, right, are not currently enslaved. They're not engaged in one of these labor processes. Okay. Now, of those who are, this black portion over here, right, most of them are engaged in the prison household production, okay, what I've called the SFCP 1. So they're producing use values. And this is something that we can observe, in the history of prisons for the data that we have. It usually takes somewhere between a quarter, 25%, or to a third, 33% or so, something like that. Maybe it's as low as 20%, but it usually takes about that proportion of the inmates to produce the goods and services, which will then make up a portion of their welfare, right? So not all of the inmates can even be in commodity production, given that the inmates are going to produce their own. I mean, they potentially they could, but then they would still have to be provided with those use values, right? They have to come from somewhere else. So the way things are now, a very small proportion is in commodity production, and then there's another small proportion which is subsumed to one or both of these, meaning that they provide conditions of existence. They receive payment out of the surplus. They're not direct producers themselves. All right. So we could look at, like, why is this, right? Why are so few, as a proportion, right, inmates enslaved? And this has to do with the history. Okay. So get a look at the history of prisons and prison labor. In the 1800s, many prisons extracted enough surplus from inmates to pay for all of the expenses of the prison. So this is like the holy grail of prisons or whatever, right? The totally self-sufficient prison. It doesn't take any, it's not a dime of taxpayer money goes to support this prison, because it all comes out of the surplus that the inmates themselves produce. However, so that used to exist, right? Mid 1800s, in places like this one. This is Parchman Prison in Mississippi, an infamous prison. Very worked the inmates very, very hard, and a lot of the inmates died. And you can see there's a lot of common elements here with slavery. This guy here in the forefront, okay, this guy is what would be called a slave overseer in the past, but is here, the term for this in this particular setting is a trustee, right? So they're an inmate themselves, but look, they're armed, right? They're armed, and their job is, they're trusted, right? Their job is to oversee the other inmates. If one tries to escape, shoot them, Wow, you could give that to an inmate? Yes, very common, right? So, and this would be an example of what I would call a subsumed class position, or a subsumed slave, right? They are still enslaved, but they have a very different position within that. They're not directly producing anything. They're providing a condition of existence, labor discipline, right? Punishment, enforcement, okay? So what changed, right? We had a situation where nearly universal enslavement of every single inmate in the slave fundamental class process. Now, some of them were still producing, use values. They weren't all producing commodities. Some of them were still doing the prison household production, because you need that, right? What happened? Well, what happened is capitalist firms outside prison and labor unions, they both agreed, look, this is unfair. We don't like the competition. We want to restrict prison labor. We don't want to be competing with inmates, because it's not the same, right? Inmates, the labor unions and the capitalist enterprises both agreed, well, you don't have to pay them anything, you basically, and they even said, you're using slave labor. So, they pushed to restrict, for laws that restricted prison labor, and they got those passed, in the early to mid 20th century. So these laws that limited the sale of prison commodities resulted in falling enslavement, particularly these black bars indicate commodity production. Okay, so we see, look, it used to be that in 1885, the total number, as best as we can determine, right, that participated in the slave fundamental class process is almost 100%, right? It's like 93%. Very, very high, okay? Now, a certain proportion of them, here it looks like it's about 20%, was required to do the household production. This is the white part, okay? Still, we had a lot of commodity production going on, right? Generates a lot of revenue. So this was true in 1895, but by 1905, there had been some restriction of markets, and this is the main way that this was done. How can we limit this? Try to push the prison enterprises to only be producing in certain markets, for example. So by the time we get to the 20s, we see this proportion has fallen. But a major law was passed in 1940, which limited this. So by the time we get to 2001, we find, well, the percentage here is much, much lower, right? And this is, again, because we have limited the sale of prison commodities. We've outlawed interstate commerce, for example. So this is a falling pattern of enslavement. Now, some of those were reversed in the late 70s. So it's not necessary that the percentage of enslavement, in recent history it's been high, right, in the late 1800s, or it happens to be very low today. That is just the product of the history, the legal environment, and so forth, right? Now, because it's very low, that creates a situation where, and because we have a money payment attached to these low, to the slave fundamental class processing commodity production that is often higher than it is even in household production, well, that creates a lot of demand on the part of these inmates who, like I said, they need a money income, just like anybody does, right? It creates a demand on their part to participate in this, right? It's a curious situation where they want to be enslaved, right? Does that mean they're not slaves? Not at all, right? Again, they are subject to a set of political, cultural, and economic processes which enables their ownership to be the ownership of their labor power to be owned by somebody else, right? That pushes them to produce necessary and surplus labor, which is then appropriated in terms of the total product by somebody else, right? The welfare plays a role in shaping this. So they choose to be enslaved, but they are still enslaved, right? All of these forces together produce that unique form of slavery. It's got common elements with slavery in many other historical periods, but it is unique, okay? That the form of slavery in U.S. prisons is its own thing, which is shaped by the unique constellation of forces that produces prison life. All right, so my presentation, based on a book that I wrote, based on the research of my dissertation, this book is called Prison Labor in the United States, An Economic Analysis. And I go into a lot more detail in the book about, the different kinds of appropriation of surplus. I give a detailed example of a prison enterprise, a state enterprise, and how much money is involved. And, if you're interested in that, you can check out my book. All right, that's my presentation. Thank you very much.